I'd like to take a little time today and talk to you about recommendations for wiring your railroad. Starting a railroad with a ready-to-run set is a good beginning, but as that begins to grow, your wiring also needs to grow with it. One thing that we recommend at Lionel is what we call bus wiring. And all that means is that we're providing a bus line, if you will. We have our transformer, whatever it is, and we have two wires connected to it. One is red, the other is black. Red would be AC hot, black would be AC ground. We're going to take this bus wire and we're going to string it around our railroad. Now, assuming that this transformer and these two wires are running one loop of track, and our railroad is, for argument's sake, 16 feet this way and 8 feet this way. And our transformers will be located here. We'll take our bus wire connected to our transformer and we'll bring and run it like so. And maybe we'll bring it here and we'll just stop. This bus wire is not going to reconnect to our transformer. It's just going to stop right there and be tied off. That bus wire should be nothing larger than 16 gauge stranded wire. The reason we want stranded wire is because electricity travels around the wire, not through it. So the higher the strand count, the more current that wire will handle. 18 gauge wire, stranded, is also acceptable for our bus. Depending upon the size of the railroad, even if this 16 feet were 1600 feet and this 8 feet were 800 feet, we would still go with the 16 gauge stranded bus wire. What this bus wire allows us to do is to put feeders or drops from our track to our bus wire. So instead of having a spaghetti factory under our railroad where we have 15 or 20 pairs of wires running back into a really ugly jumbled web of wires on a small turn nut, we have a very organized wiring system, basically. What we do is we have our track and we have a wire connected to our center rail and our outside rail. And we drop this and connect it to our bus. And this happens about every 10 to 20 feet. The less space that you have between your drops, the more even amount of power you will have distributed throughout your railroad. Now, if your bus is 16 gauge and your feeders are 18 gauge, that is sufficient. There's no problem with that at all. If your bus is 16 and your feeders are 16, that's entirely your choice. I will say that it is tougher to get 16 gauge wire soldered to the track than it is 18 gauge wire. It's also very much more difficult to get a 16 gauge wire into those small terminal connectors or spade connectors that go onto the sections of fast track, if that's what you're using, or even soldered to 027 or O gauge track. So 18 gauge feeders, 18 gauge stranded feeders connected to a 16 gauge stranded bus is more than sufficient. Now, as we increase the number of tracks that we have on our railroad, meaning loops of track that we can run one train or multiple trains on unattended simultaneously. So for instance, 4 loops of track would allow us to run 4 trains independently, walk away knowing full well they won't collide. So in an instance where we have 4 tracks, 4 loops of track, what we need for a bus wire is really only 5 wires. Why 5? Because we would have one that would be AC ground. We would have another one that would be loop 1, loop 2, loop 3, and loop 4. AC ground is our outside rails. Loop 1 is our center rail on track 1, or loop 1. Loop 2 is our center rail on track 2. Loop 3 is the center rail on track 3. Loop 4 is the center rail on track 4. 5-wire bus, 4 loops of track. AC hot for each track separately, and a ground for all outside rails can be tied to one ground. This is going to give us a common ground setup. We want to make sure that we use common rail or common ground when we wire up our 3-rail trains. The reason for this is because with a common rail, this goes back to the video we did on phasing our transformers. With a common rail, common ground, we can use the outside rail in an insulated blocks format to trigger our accessories, to trigger our animations. 1 wire is all that's required for ground. Now, if you want to add a separate ground for each loop of track, that's entirely up to you, but it's not really necessary. As our railroad grows, so will the requirement for the amount of wire that we use. What I mean by that is, we may have a remote switch that is 16 feet down the railroad, or 16 feet away from the control panel. The wire that comes with your remote switches isn't long enough to cover that distance. And there's no reason to go out and buy special flat wire or flat wire cable. It's just not necessary. You can use something as simple as phone cable. Phone cable is inexpensive. You can get a lot of it for a little bit of money, and it does the same job that a flat ribbon cable would do, or even the cable that comes with the switches. Same deal. Your remote switch machines use virtually no amperage, which means that it doesn't really need to be stranded wire on your switch machines, or the constant voltage power to the switch machines really doesn't have to be a heavy stranded wire. 22, 24 gauge is more than sufficient. But on your controller, getting over that long distance for the least amount of money, this phone cable works great. You can get a 500-foot roll of this at a Home Depot store or a do-it-yourself store for $25. 500 feet will get you a long way. And what's great is it's all color-coded. So you make sure that you hook your wires up consistently on one end. You get 16 feet away, there's still the same color codes on the other end to hook up to your switches, your accessories, whatever. Well, mainly your switches. Accessories, you want to stick with 22 or 24 gauge wire, because most accessories have incandescent lamps, so they're going to want they're going to need a little more amperage than what you can provide through telephone wire. Your accessories can be wired the same way. You can do a bus. You know, you've got your standalone accessory transformer, and you can have 2 wires from that. AC hot and ground, and this is a fixed 18 volt or a fixed 14 volt. Run that bus all the way around your railroad. This way you've only got to make your wires this long instead of from that accessory all the way back to the transformer. Much cleaner, easier to troubleshoot. You want to try to color code these wires as best you can, so your center rail track and your grounds, you know, red, blue, green, yellow, black would traditionally be ground. Same thing on your accessories. You want to make sure your accessory bus is a different color than your track bus, so you don't get confused. And it's also a good idea to include 2 or 3 or even 4 accessory buses going around the railroad, and tie your accessories to each one differently. Meaning, if you have street lamps on your railroad, tie all of those to one specific bus. Illuminated buildings to another AC hot bus. Cross bucks and signals and crossing gates to yet another bus. The reason you want to do that is because as your railroad grows and you add more and more accessories to it, ultimately you're reducing the amount of amperage available by that accessory transformer. So eventually you will get to a point where you've just overtaxed the available amperage of a transformer that's powering those accessories, and you'll realize I either have to get a bigger transformer, or I've got to disconnect accessories until it comes back on, at which point you're going to have to yet add another transformer and do it all over again. So if you do it from the onset, save yourself a lot of time and grief in the future, and troubleshooting problems with color-coded wirings and no spaghetti factory mess underneath your railroad, you'll be thanking us in the long run.